Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Allison Kelly Hedgepath. Welcome to our Lown webinar series. Thank you for joining us today. And I'm thrilled to be joined by Skylar Griggs, one of my favorite colleagues, who has been a prior host on the webinar series, although we were just reminiscing that time flies because it's been a number of years since you've been here.
2020.
Skylar is a registered dietitian. She runs the preventative cardiology nutrition clinic at Children's Hospital and also is busy with a private practice. And she and I co-manage many patients together. So welcome, Skylar.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. We were just reminiscing. It was 2020 was the last time, so things have definitely changed since that time. I'm just going to start my slideshow from the beginning. So I apologize. My colleague Coco was supposed to be here today. She's unfortunately had to run to the hospital to take on a patient task. So I will be leading the charge today, if that is okay. I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the items that I'd be addressing today. So in terms of the material that we're going to cover, we're going to chat a bit about an overview on nutrition for optimal heart and gut health. We'll spend some time talking about 5 simple changes that you can do to optimize your heart health. And then we'll also just take a peek at some resources and where we kind of move forward from. I will be sharing with you, to any of the participants of this talk today, my 3-day heart healthy meal plan. So when we meet with a patient in the Newbury Street Nutrition practice, we provide them with kind of these tailored meal plans. This is a more generic heart healthy meal plan, but it has some really good ideas and hopefully some brands that you'll find helpful as well. Here, I think I have to, oh, there we go. So when we look at the bigger picture of nutrition, it can be really overwhelming to kind of decipher all the different titles. What is low fat versus what is organic, all natural and whole grain? And I think it gets particularly confusing when we think about it from the perspective of your heart. So in terms of heart health, you know, which of these phrases or which of these things are really important to know as it relates to heart health, to overall metabolic health, to weight management. And there's so many different diet trends, and there just continues to be I started my practice in 2014, so we've been, 10 years. And so things have just changed so much from where I started, from intermittent fasting to no fat to low fat to high carb to low carb to gluten-free. So there's just a lot of confusion over nutrition. So my goal today is kind of just to break it down in a bit more simpler terms for you. If I could take the simplest approach to nutrition, it would be this general healthy eating plate. So this is kind of an offshoot of the My Plate, which many people are probably familiar with. That's part of the USDA dietary guidelines. While I appreciate that version, I really, really like the version that Harvard Medical School, the Chan School, put out. Because I think it provides a bit more details and some important points on kind of where different nutrients are coming from, what the sources are. It just feels a little more approachable to me. So big picture, the goal is to make half of what you're eating at lunch and dinner vegetables, fruit and some vegetables. And the reason for this that we'll talk a lot about today, as many of you are probably really familiar with, is that one of the biggest goals for optimizing your heart health, your weight, your blood sugar, your LDL cholesterol, your triglycerides, your insulin levels is increasing the amount of fiber that you get from food, not from supplements, but from food in your diet. Fruits and veggies are a very big source of fiber, and then there are some certain whole grain sources that are excellent as well. The other thing to kind of keep in mind is we really want to emphasize an intake of healthy fats, and we'll talk a bit about this today, but not all fat is bad, and including sources of mono and polyunsaturated fats will boost your heart health and boost something called your HDL cholesterol. The other thing that this plate takes into account is water and fluids. So making sure that you're getting, unless you have a fluid restriction, of course, but making sure you're getting kind of that 64 to 72 ounces of water a day, and especially if you're increasing fiber in your diet. And then the other thing that we're going to speak a little bit about today is just protein and healthy protein sources. Weaved in throughout this talk is also some information on gut health and optimizing your gut health. And gut health and cardiovascular health, kind of the thing that brings them together is fiber. Prebiotic fibers are natural sources of the types of things that promote healthy microbiome. So when we chat about some of these items today, we're going to spend some time talking about some of the GI health aspects as well. So if we could take 5 simple changes and think about just 5 very to the point things that you could work on, these would be the 5 things in my practice that I tell most of my patients. Boosting fiber, we're going to spend quite a bit of time on. I briefly touched on it before, but not skimping out on fat. There are fats that are good for your heart and fats that are not so good for your heart. And so we want to make sure that you're getting enough of the fats that are good for your heart. We'll talk a bit about balancing your plate, which we just briefly touched on before, and also timing. So one of the most common things that I tend to see when patients come to me is they're exceeding 5, 6, 7 hours between their meals. You get really busy during the day, you might have breakfast, and then you might not eat again until dinner time. The hard part with this is it starts to affect something called blood sugar, which can affect your metabolism, among other things, your mood. And so we'll dive into that as well. And then just being aware of calories consumed from beverages. So sometimes, people are really aware about the calories that come from alcohol and sports drinks. They don't think as much about that Starbucks drink or some of the sweetened coffee drinks, some of the sweetened teas that you just didn't realize that there was added sugar in. So we'll spend some time on that as well. In terms of fiber, our number one take home point, fiber occurs naturally. So it is in fruits and vegetables. It occurs in certain whole grains and then nuts and seeds. And the reason that we like fiber is because fiber, especially specific to kind of your different blood levels, so your cholesterol, your blood sugar, it goes through the body and it kind of picks up the stuff that we don't want too much of, and it moves out through your body when you go to the bathroom. So we really like our patients. We really like any individual, any adult individual, to get at a minimum 30 grams of fiber a day, unless you've been told otherwise for reasons related to GI conditions or things like that. Most adults that come to me, and kids as well in practice, are eating somewhere between 5 to 10 grams of fiber a day. So if you're not thinking about it, it can be a really hard number to hit. Oftentimes people will say to me, well, I eat a lot of fruits and vegetables, so I must be eating enough fiber. But when we actually calculate it in a food journal and we kind of have people put it in, it's a lot lower than they initially thought. So we really try to recommend somewhere between 30 to 40 grams of fiber a day. This will help cholesterol, blood pressure, blood sugar. It's not a supplement. It's something natural that comes from food. And kind of finding the source of fiber that works best for you is something that takes time. The other piece of fiber is that it increases your fullness level. So it increases your satiety. So for people who are trying to manage their weight, when they increase their amount of fiber in their diet, they don't notice that they kind of get that hunger an hour or two after eating. And then by increasing your fiber intake, you're going to be increasing your intake of all the things that are good for your heart in general. When we look at a food label, and specifically at fiber, the first place that we look at is the serving size. And I'm sure many of you have kind of gone through food label reading before. So just excuse me while I just run through it just quickly for 1 minute. The serving size is the most important piece, because if the portion is doubled or tripled, everything on this label gets doubled or tripled. I think sometimes people's eyes go right to calories, and actually in my practice, I don't spend a ton of time focused solely on calories. I really care about the breakdown of these numbers. So When we think about trying to hit, somewhere between 30 to 40 grams of fiber a day, you want to try to choose foods that have, somewhere between 5, 6 grams of fiber per serving, depending on the food. The total carbohydrate, which is the number right here, minus the fiber, which is the number right here, gives you something called net carbohydrates. And net carbohydrates are the amount of carbohydrate that your body actually metabolizes. It's the amount that you actually take in. And that's important because, and we'll kind of touch base on this in the next slide, but that's really important because when we're thinking about targets for weight management, cholesterol, blood pressure, it's the net carbohydrate number that we're really, really interested in. And one thing we'll talk about when we talk about sugary drinks is sugar. A really kind of easy rule of thumb that I use with kids and I also use with adults is 4 grams of sugar would be like a packet of sugar from Dunkin' Donuts, the packets. I don't know if they still have those. Um, so if you see a food or an item that has 28 grams of sugar in it, if you wouldn't sit and open 7 packets of sugar, it's probably not a good idea to pick that food, especially if you're dealing with high triglycerides, elevated blood sugar, trying to manage your weight, things like that. The carbs and the fiber are, we kind of talked about it. So the carbohydrate minus the fiber gives you this true amount of carbohydrates called net carbohydrates. Our body needs carbohydrates. They're very important. They're an especially important source of energy. In excess, we know that they can cause weight gain. Ideas of kind of what we think of as more simpler carbohydrates would be things like breads and cookies and cakes and crackers and sugary snacks and things like that. What we really want to focus on is getting the carbohydrates that are rich in fiber. So in the meal plan that we send to you after this talk, you will see food sources specifically that have additional fiber in them. So you might see certain types of breads or certain types of vegetables or certain types of things like chia seeds or flax seeds, which you might be familiar with, that have fiber in them. And as I mentioned, I can't say enough about fiber. Boosts metabolism, helps with hunger, helps kind of manage all your blood levels, and then helps with gut health, promoting kind of a healthy microbiome, and lowering your chronic disease risk because it kind of targets, a number of those blood levels we were talking about before. In terms of blood sugar and fiber, this is something that I show all the new patients that come to see me because we know that we need to eat more fiber. So that's number one. But I think understanding why we need to eat more fiber and proteins and fats is also really important too. So when we think about carbohydrates, as I mentioned before, we're thinking about breads, rice, pastas, rolls, and then things that are, we think of as simpler carbohydrates. So cookies, cakes, pastries, juices, sodas, things like that. I want you to think of this, right? So on this axis is your blood sugar level right here, or something called glucose, which you may have heard before. And on this axis is time. So on the bottom axis is time, on this axis is your blood sugar level. So when we think about kind of the way that food affects blood sugar, when you eat something like, let's use white pasta or white bread as an example, or even a banana. Bananas are great. The great source of fruit. Let's say you have a banana. What it will do if you just eat a banana is it will cause your blood sugar to go up and come down pretty quickly within an hour. So that's why if you have a big bowl of white pasta, you might feel kind of, an hour or two later, like, oh, I need a little bit more. I'm feeling hungry still, even if it was a larger portion. When you eat protein with that banana, so think things like cheese, cottage cheese, Greek yogurt, and depending on the different fat levels, depending on kind of where you are with your cholesterol and kind of where you're focusing. But when you combine that banana with any source of protein or fat, it's going to stabilize your blood sugar. So that's why if you had a banana and you have it with peanut butter, you're going to feel a lot more full than if you just had the banana by itself. So kind of just thinking about these food combinations a little bit is really important. The other piece is that many people that come to me are kind of on what we call a blood sugar roller coaster. So their blood sugar is coming up and down very often during the day. The difficult thing about that is when your blood sugar spikes like this, it tells your pancreas to secrete something called insulin, which tells your body to promote to kind of promote fat storage, take whatever you're eating and store it. So if you're someone who's trying to manage your weight, those combinations of foods are really, really important to not only fullness, but to also kind of balancing out metabolism. If your blood sugar is low, you can also feel funky, moody, irritable. I'm sure many have had that experience before. So kind of in that realm, thinking about not skimping out on sources of dietary fat. So there are four sources of fat in that we as a world know about. So saturated fat and trans fat are the two fats that tend to raise LDL cholesterol. Saturated fats tend to come from full fat animal sources. So you think of things like red meats, full fat dairy, fried food, um, donuts, pastries, pies, trans fat, which they have taken off the market, it generally isn't available in many foods and is supposed to be illegal. I'm not sure what they replaced it with, but the idea is that it was supposed to be taken out entirely. That those tend to be in things that can sit on the shelf and never go bad. We call them CVS foods or convenience store foods. So chips, Oreos, Twinkies, stuff like that that could just sit there forever. There are two types of fats that are really good for you to have in your diet. One is called monounsaturated fat, and the other is called polyunsaturated fat. And these are incredibly important because not only do they make you feel full, do they balance your blood sugar, they also increase something called your HDL cholesterol, which is the cholesterol that protects your heart. So food sources would be things like fish, flax seeds, chia seeds, walnuts, Brussels sprouts, spinach, soybeans. If you are a vegetarian and you don't eat fish, there are algae-based omega-3 supplements that are great. I will just say one caveat. We generally like you to get the omega-3 through food. In some people, we have seen that omega-3 supplementation can raise the LDL. So we really want you to increase your intake of omega-3 rich foods, but sometimes supplementation with omega-3 isn't the best idea and is definitely something to talk about with your provider. Other ways to think about boosting fat intake. So people become, a bit fearful of things like tuna salad or salmon salad, but actually if you're using a nice avocado oil or avocado oil based mayo or even olive oil based mayo, you can have a little bit of tuna fish. My only warning with that would be just try not to have it more than twice a week because it is a rich source of mercury. But salmon, have as much as you want. Salmon is a great source of omega-3s. It's excellent for your heart. A lot of us will talk about things like trail mixes with nuts and seeds, putting things like this over your yogurt, or putting things like walnut or nut butters into your smoothies will increase your amount of omega-3s as well. Hummus as a spread on sandwiches and dips, and then thinking about things like ground flaxseed, chia seed, or hemp seed on oatmeal and cereal seem to help a bit as well. Supplements we briefly touched on. So EPA and DHA give us the true amount of omega-3. If you are someone who was recommended by your provider to take an omega-3 supplement, you just want to be sure that when you're looking for the total amount, you're adding up that EPA and DHA number. Sources of saturated fats and heart healthy fats that we kind of spoke about. So the saturated fats would be things like butters and cheeses. Most patients that come to me, it tends to be things like cheeses, really nice cheeses. It doesn't have to be the American. It could be really delicious things like brie and goat cheeses. Those tend to have a bit more saturated fat. And then coconut oil. I think sometimes people forget it can have some LDL raising effects. And so paying attention to that as well is really important. The sources of heart healthy fats that we touched on are listed out here as well. I have a newest seed that I've been recommending to a lot of my patients. It's called basil seed. And it's great to add on top of salads. So there's a brand called Zen, Zen basil seed. So if you do the chia seed, if you do the flax seed, and you just need another seed or another idea of something, I really like the basil seeds. Those are a nice alternative as well. In terms of the fish, wild salmon when you can do it is great. If it's a limiting factor for you, I think you should still eat the salmon. Even if it's farm raised, you're still going to get some health benefits from that. But wild salmon, when you can do it, is definitely the way to go. We talked a bit about the label, just to go into a little bit more detail. I mentioned the piece on sugar, choosing grains with more fiber than sugar. So when you're paying attention here, you want to try, ideally, to try to, get the foods that have more fiber than the total amount of sugar, and really get an idea of what the breakdown of fats is. So if 1 gram is coming from saturated fat, then 7 grams are coming from healthy fat, and that's really, really important. In terms of the plate, which we spoke about a bit in the beginning, making half of lunch and dinner veggies is the goal. I will say the one caveat to that being potatoes, peas, and corn. Potatoes, peas, and corn are metabolized a bit more like carbohydrates. So we want you to increase your intake of those non-starchy or all other vegetables except potatoes, peas, and corn. It doesn't mean you can't have them. It just means that we want you to put them on this section of the plate. We want you to think of them more as your grain option. Aiming to have 4 to 5 ounces of protein. So think about your hand, looking at your hand, everyone's hand size is different, or a deck of cards would be 3 ounces. So having a bit more than that. In perimenopause, menopause, postmenopause, this is extremely important to make sure that you're keeping your protein levels up. And also for any individual, exercise-wise, if you're boosting up your exercise, make sure that you're getting a decent amount of protein. There's general recommendations, around protein. We usually tell people, if you're moderately active, to take your weight in kilograms and multiply it by around 1.2 to 1.4. That's just a general recommendation. And that's the amount of protein we want you to get. We don't want you to overdo protein. It's not great for your kidneys to overdo protein. So having an idea of how much you need is definitely important. And that's where even just food journaling for, a day or two can be really helpful, just to get a sense of what you're doing. And then including healthy fats, into your diet, including healthy fats for energy through the day, thinking about that blood sugar cycle, promoting energy, balancing energy levels. So in terms of timing, this was kind of our third bullet on the list. The goal is to aim to eat something every 4 to 5 hours. So if you're able to try to, keep intake consistent and have something to eat every 4 to 5 hours, you're going to keep those blood sugar levels stable. Trying to have balanced meals and snacks. So combining your fruit or grain with some kind of protein or fat that we were talking about. Oftentimes people will come to us and they'll have breakfast, as I said, and then they won't eat again till dinner. Ideally, if you can do breakfast snack, lunch snack, dinner, that's great. That's wonderful. Trying to avoid grazing throughout the day, if you can kind of stick on that trajectory, and not exceeding 4 to 5 hours between meals is good. A common misconception that we often get is that if we skip meals, you will lose weight. And we actually know, based on the research, that that's not the fact. Again, this is different than intermittent fasting. This isn't specific to intermittent fasting. But if you skip meals, you're slowing down the machine, you're slowing down your metabolism. So you want to try to think about having, as we said, something to eat every 4 to 5 hours. A weight loss sometimes in the short term will appear, but oftentimes it's from muscle, because the muscles aren't getting the protein that they need, and they're starting to, to shrink down a bit. More commonly, what we tend to see in people that skip meals is that majority of their calories occur in the evening. So if I see a patient and I look at their food journal, And the majority of their calories are after 6 p.m. at night, and it's 800 to 1,000 calories. That's going to have an effect in your metabolism, over time. Plus, it saps your energy and focus if you're not consistently kind of, again, going back to that blood sugar model, having, meals and snacks throughout the day. In terms of drinking, things like alcohol, sugary drinks, one to me is not better than the other. And of course, I fall in line with the American Heart Association recommendations, 1 drink for women, 2 drinks max for men. Um, Moderation in these cases is really important. I think, some people will come to me and they'll have multiple drinks in one sitting, and that can actually be more tough on your cholesterol and on your liver and on your body than 1 glass of wine a night. I don't think that alcohol needs to be a part of a heart healthy diet. If you are someone who enjoys having a drink at night, I would just keep it within those recommendations. What I tend to see more commonly is that people have a drink in a social setting, and then it makes it really hard to make a good decision about what they want to eat. So I know for myself, if I had 1 or 2 drinks and then tried to say, oh, I'm going to get the, salad with grilled chicken or fish instead of the bolognese, it's harder to do. You lose those inhibitions. And you become a bit more relaxed. So just keeping that in mind as well. In terms of drinking, not, kind of not thinking alcohol wise, I shared with you earlier this idea of 4 grams of sugar. So when, when we're thinking about sugar, 4 grams of sugar would be a sugar cube, like right here, or a packet of sugar. And that kind of helps us understand better how much sugar we actually want in our food. So if you wouldn't sit there and eat that many packets or cubes of sugar, you probably don't want to have a food that has those. For most people, I say to try to choose food choices that have 4 to 6 grams or less of sugar if you can. Of course, 80-20. If you eat healthy 80% of the time, then 20% of the time you have to live. So it's no one's being perfect. It's never going to be, the absolute perfect diet. If you can do it 80% of the time, you're in good shape. And I kind of mentioned, but things like Coca-Cola, I know people are really good with the sodas these days. I don't tend to see those as much, but I do tend to see things more like the energy drinks, the sweetened teas, the sweetened coffee drinks, things like that. So I wanted to spend some time just talking a bit about gut health here. Oops, excuse me. Let me just, sorry, I'm just going to go back to my slideshow. Sorry. Gut health, hold on here. Oops, sorry. Let me just skip ahead here. Gut health is extremely important because it runs very much in line with the cardiovascular piece. So much of your immune system lives in your gut. And it's really important that we're aware of the different nutrients that are going into our gut, and fiber plays a huge role in this. So fiber is the food for the gut. So if you think about things like prebiotics, I'm sure you've heard a bit about prebiotic fibers and probiotics. So many prebiotics come from these fiber sources. So things like asparagus and garlic and artichokes and kiwis, oats, green bananas, apples, all really, really rich sources of prebiotics. And then the probiotics come in and they replenish the good. So the prebiotics feed the probiotics. The probiotics come in and they keep your bacteria in your gut very healthy, which also helps with, through this cold season, your immune system and your mood, and can, have an effect on your weight. So as much as the heart, the heart, of course, all organ systems are important, but where the heart's is important, the gut also plays a role in this as well. So the quality of your diet, the diversity of your diet, the amount of fruits and vegetables you're getting into your diet have a direct effect on the diversity of the different strains of bacteria in your gut. So just by increasing fiber in your diet, you're increasing natural prebiotics. Just by increasing vegetables in your diet, you're increasing natural prebiotics into your diet. And then probiotics. So many people will think of things like yogurt and cheese. Sauerkraut is a great source. Miso paste, kefir, kimchi and fermented foods that are more traditional in an Asian diet, excellent. Really, really good sources of probiotics that are essential for your health. In terms of, this is something that kind of came up post-pandemic, but I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on for those that do still work and do still work from home. I saw during COVID, a lot, and myself included, struggling with this idea that we're now working a bit more from home, and many people were working in their kitchens, myself included. And so the food was kind of right there. It was easy to grab. And so what I tell my patients is to try to set up a place for your work that's away from your kitchen, is away from your snacks, is away from things that you can kind of pick on throughout the day. Take your protein shake or your food or whatever it is and bring it with you. Bring it into a new space, because oftentimes that helps reduce some of the mindless eating and snacking that happens during the day. Scheduling a time for lunch and snack, just like you would if you were in the office. So blocking off that 12 to 12:30 or 12:30 to 1 period where you know you can have a meal. Drinking plenty of water is of course essential. Um, and breaking free from the screen, which I am so guilty of. And I think many of us are eating lunch in front of our computers and our devices, and that's really hard. And that's a hard one to break. So just do the best you can, even if you take one step and you move where you're working or where you're answering your email from to out of your kitchen. That's a great improvement. That's a great step. And the last 2 points on here. So food safe house, we use this a bit with families, but I think it's completely relevant. And we try to use it in our house too, is this idea that try to keep your treats and your indulgences to outside of the house. So keep the food in the house the best that you can, the healthy options. So when you go for something, for the most part, it's a healthy option. Cookies, cakes, desserts, ice creams, things like that. Indulge in them, once a week if you want to, twice a week if you want to, but try to keep it out of the house because you're less likely to grab it if it's not there. I think sometimes it's hard when between a couple when one is on a diet or eating a certain way and the other one isn't, and then all those kind of less healthy options are around. And so treating it more as a lifestyle, we just don't bring a lot of that stuff into the house is huge. And then of course, I'm also not terribly good at this one, but not eating out of a bag. So I'm sure you've heard this one many times before, but trying to portion food ahead of time, kind of taking that serving, putting it in a bowl just to get a sense of how much you're actually eating. So a bit about our practice. So Newbury Street Nutrition is our practice. I started over 10 years ago, and we have Coco Oker is my colleague that works closely with me. We're in the process of actually hiring another dietitian, which is really exciting. And in our practice, we spend time going through different types of meal plans. We do individual sessions. And we really get a sense of kind of ways to not only optimize your diet, but to optimize your heart health. So I think sometimes when people go to a dietitian, they think, oh, she's going to tell me what not to eat. It's much more tailored and targeted than that. If you're someone who's struggling with high cholesterol, high blood pressure, we really focus in on those numbers and work closely with the people at Lown to kind of monitor those numbers over time and get a sense of what's going on. So feel free to email me. It will also be on the meal plans that we send around. You can also book with us directly, on our site. So thank you.
That was wonderful, Skylar. Thank you.
It was a little quicker, a little quicker.
It was a whirlwind of information. So,
yes.
and there are a lot of questions, which I think is nice because this gives us time to kind of delve into some details. Because I think many of the points you covered, we could probably spend the whole hour just talking about some of these, little questions. I will just make the point and reiterate what you said is there isn't, I think, one best diet out there. Like each of us are very different. And I like the approach that we're almost each our own control, because we can
Yes.
try things and kind of see how it works for us and how it works for our labs, right? As we're really trying to, build the best diet for each of us.
Yep.
And I know many of the patients of mine that you work with, we're doing that, right? We make some changes, and then we're repeating labs and really seeing, if we've moved the bar, right, on some of these
Right.
health metrics. So some of the things that overlap, there's a lot of overlap, I think, between heart health and gut health, right? Fiber, as you alluded to, is, I think, one of the most common overlaps, and probably I get multiple emails a week from patients about the fiber. So I know you kind of gave an overview, but maybe give us a little bit more targeted direction and what you're thinking about when you're making fiber recommendations.
Great question. So what I think about when I'm making fiber recommendations is, and what we provide patients with, and I can give you like some names of some general names that you would have some sense of, but we give them very specific brands that we know are rich sources of fiber. So in our practice a lot, we use these this fiber-rich brand of breads. There's a bread called Sammy's. I think it's SAMIS, and they have a low-carb line that's really nice ingredients, made with a lot of almond flour and bean flour and things like that. Really rich source of fiber, but actually tastes good. We use things like the Mission Carb Balance tortillas. We use different types of high fiber cereals, in addition to fruits. So berries, raspberries, blueberries, different types of artichokes. Artichokes are a really rich source of fiber, avocado. And so when you track your diet, and when you're getting a sense of what your diet looks like in the course of a day, and you're trying to hit that 30 grams, you just end up choosing things that kind of can fill in those spaces. So for many of my patients, it might look like a breakfast that has some high fiber sunflower seed, chia seed mixed granola. And at lunch, they might include a high fiber whole grain wrap to their, vegetable and protein mix. And at dinner, it could be more like proteins and vegetables. Maybe they have a snack that has some chia or flaxseed or something like that. So that helps kind of just to give a sense of where the fiber is coming from. And then the other thing I'll say about fiber too that's really important is you don't want to go from 0 to 60 with fiber. So you don't want to, be someone who's not eating much fiber at all, and then kind of catapult to 40 grams of fiber a day, because for some people it can really bother their stomachs. And so we tell people to increase fiber slowly, increase it with water, and to kind of do it over time that way. And in terms of the gut health piece, the prebiotic fiber piece, those sources of fiber that we mentioned that are really, really good for the gut are, the nice thing about them is so many of them are available everywhere. So if you're looking at a label, you might see things like inulin or chicory root. Those are natural fiber sources. Those are natural prebiotics that are really good for you.
And are those insoluble fibers?
I believe so. Soluble fibers are the most studied when it comes to cholesterol levels. I think they're probably a mix of all the different types. I don't spend a ton of time like kind of splitting between the two, because I find that if soluble is lowering your cholesterol, then the insoluble is probably, kind of doing other great things for your body, whether it's your microbiome or your blood pressure or things like that. So I try not to, to split it up too much, but yes, I think it's probably a mix of both.
Well, I just asked because there's a question. Can you say a few words about soluble versus insoluble, and are we aiming for one over the other?
So it all has to do with the way that it kind of hangs out in your intestines, for lack of a better word. So the soluble fiber kind of promotes a viscous, it's more of a viscous texture around the foods that you eat. Soluble fibers, there's certain types of, so oatmeal is a soluble fiber. There's certain types of soluble fibers that are just more available, but I don't spend a ton of time on soluble versus insoluble. I think if you could just get that total number up, you're in good shape.
Great advice. And I hear from patients all the time, vegetables don't agree with me. So I'm just never going to be able to eat enough fiber. And I think it's nice to hear right?
Yes.
How you're thinking about this and how there's other options for us to kind of layer in and get the fiber up.
Yeah, and I think for some people that are dealing with things like SIBO or need to follow a low FODMAP diet, and they see this fiber number, it's like, oh my gosh, that's a lot of fiber. How am I going to hit that? It's amazing over the 10 years how many brands and listed, things that we've come up with that are gut friendly, that don't seem to hurt the stomach as much. And again, every patient is different, so it's very individualized. But yeah, if vegetables don't agree with you, or broccoli, you're like, oh, broccoli really gives me a stomach ache, which is so common. There are so many other sources of fiber and ways that we could boost it.
Okay, I'm going to keep going through these questions. There's a
Sure.
question here about the ketogenic diet, and is this good for us?
So the ketogenic diet was originally developed as a tool to manage seizures. So it was for epilepsy, and that's why it was originally created. It did have a little bit of bump, I noticed, in popularity, maybe like a couple years ago, where people were talking about it a lot more. The thing about the ketogenic that I like people to keep in mind with the ketogenic diet is it does not decipher what fats are, whether it's saturated fat, mono, poly, or trans. So you could be someone who has high LDL cholesterol and you may go on a ketogenic diet that is so rich in saturated fat that it could actually bump your cholesterol. So what I try to have patients do is just increase their overall intake of fat. Um, different percentages vary from person to person. I think the ketogenic diet works because it's fairly low carb, and that's something that we do a fairly low carb lifestyle approach in our practice. But if you're going to do the ketogenic diet, I would try to make sure that the fats that you're getting are good sources of fat.
So that's well said, and I would agree with that. And I think sometimes those terms get used synonymously, a
Yes,
low carb diet and a ketogenic diet. And I
yes,
think we have to be a little bit careful with that.
yes.
In general, we eat way too much sugar and simple carbohydrates, right? So all of us, I think, are really focused on kind of limiting, those processed foods in our diet, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're eating a ketogenic diet, which is really high in fat.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes, I think that's absolutely true. And I think that, sometimes people will come to me and we'll be looking at their pie chart, and they'll say, "Oh my gosh, my diet's 40% fat," but almost all of it is coming from mono and polyunsaturated fats. I'm okay with that. I mean, that to me is still, there's still some really, as long as your proteins and your fiber look good, if you're someone who tends to favor more healthy fats, I think that's okay.
And that's somewhere going back to our original statement that us following labs or patients working with their doctors to follow their labs makes a difference, right? Because I definitely have seen some real elevations in cholesterol levels, right, on certain
Yes.
diets, right, that would
Yep.
maybe force us, to change things sooner instead of continuing down that path.
Yeah, and I
There
think
are,
that's the, oh, go
go
ahead.
ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that's the really nice part about working with a dietitian, working with a provider like you that gets to work with a dietitian, where we can work together and say, oh, the LDL was a little bit high, so let's focus on saturated fats this time, or the HDL was a little bit low. Let's focus on healthy fats this time. Kind of monitoring those numbers is great.
Yeah, it's nice to have, feedback for our own bodies too.
Yeah.
So along those lines, while we're still talking about fats, there's a couple of questions about, how to pick an olive oil and
Yep.
then other oils like palm oil and soybean oil.
Yeah, so we know that generally the best oil is olive oil. That's what's been studied in the Predimed studies as kind of being the most heart healthy oil. If you're cooking at very high temperatures, you would want to try to include things like avocado oil, like if you're going above 425 degrees, because olive oil can destabilize at certain temperatures. So trying to choose avocado oil for more high heat cooking is helpful. Palm oil and tends to be in kind of more shelf stable products. If the product is lower in saturated fat, and you're managing that for your cholesterol, I think that's okay. I don't, you'll see some peanut butters that have palm oil in them. If it's a natural peanut butter, I don't think that's the end of the world, but you probably don't want to go wild with palm oil. Um, I think something that comes up a bit more often is this question of coconut oil. And in some people, coconut oil seems to really boost the LDL cholesterol. And it's just in some people, it's absorbed differently. It's medium chain triglyceride oil. It's absorbed differently in your liver, but in some people, it really makes that LDL go up. And so for my heart health patients, I tell them to try to just be aware of how much they're using.
And we were seeing that a few years ago, that the levels of coconut oil really did go up as more people were doing a ketogenic diet, and I think that's
Yes.
leveled off.
Yes.
And then I know the audience here is quite savvy in terms of olive oil, but I'll just reiterate what you said, because the Predimed study, which really tested olive oil against a low-fat diet, showed cardiovascular risk reduction almost 30% with
Yes.
eating lots of olive oil, right?
Yep.
So,
Yep.
and this was added to foods after they were cooked. So to
Right.
speak to your point about the smoke point, right? That the
Right.
olive oil can be added to your salad, to your vegetables afterwards, and
Right.
is
Right.
really considered heart healthy.
Yeah.
And tastes good, right? And
Yeah, and can be
for
added to
satiety.
anything. Can be added to anything, right? Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. And it doesn't have to be the fancy olive oil. It can just kind of be your, your standard olive oil.
So the other important topic that we commonly are talking about in cardiology is, how do we get ample potassium from our diet?
Good question. Good question. I am just to give you I'm gonna just grab my charger because my battery is just dying. I'm
Okay.
gonna lose you. So I'm just gonna turn my video off for a second as I answer this. Um, so potassium, we think of potassium as being in a banana, but potassium actually is in a lot of different types of foods. So we think of things like potatoes and sweet potatoes and different nuts and seeds and so it's really, really important that for people who have kind of they take certain medications for their blood pressure, that they're aware of how much potassium they have in their diet. And so if we're seeing someone for elevated blood pressure, I do try to spend some time talking with them about the amount of potassium in their diet. And for some patients, we end up doing things like different electrolyte supplements. But it's a good conversation to have, as you know, because sometimes some of those medications related to blood pressure can have an effect on potassium.
And I usually encourage my patients with either heart disease or high blood pressure to really be looking at the potassium content that they're getting
Yes.
in a day, because we have data from the DASH diet, which is now a 30-year-old study, but still good data, where patients consumed over 4,500 milligrams of potassium a day from real food sources. And
Right.
that had a really positive impact on blood pressure. So besides bananas, leafy greens, mushrooms, avocados, a lot of different beans, right, are really good sources of potassium.
Really good. And they're the same types of foods that we talk about for heart health too. So yeah, I think that the point on potassium is so important too, because I think sometimes people go right to the food label and they're looking at potassium and vitamin D and things like that. But the goal is, if you follow a balanced diet, you're ideally kind of hitting all of those things anyway. So that's why I really like that plate, because it really emphasizes that half, that focuses on the fruits and veggies.
Okay, so we've covered carbohydrates and fiber and fats. Let's move on to protein, because this
Yeah.
also generates a lot of questions.
Yes.
So, you said aim for at least a gram per kilogram body weight. And I think that might even be a little bit on the light side. Like sometimes we even
I would say
add,
1.2 to 1.4. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
so sometimes we're even encouraging our patients to have more protein.
Yes.
Talk to us a little bit about good quality protein and supplementing protein and what your approach is.
Great question. So protein, I feel like, is something that people, as you mentioned, often don't eat enough of. So when patients come to my practice, their average protein intake might be 60, 65 grams of protein. We need protein for building lean body mass. And so I use my hand a lot as kind of an analogy, but I say, if you can use up to maybe like your first knuckle when you're thinking about the minimum amount of protein you want to get a day, a good rule of thumb that I use a lot with my patients is every ounce of protein is 10 grams of protein. This isn't across every type of protein. All of them are different, but if you just take a standard chicken breast, or you're trying to think about it really quickly, 1 ounce is about 10 grams of protein. So if you're having 3 or 4 ounces, you're getting somewhere between 30 or 40 grams of protein. Good sources of protein would be things like white meat chicken, fish, turkey, leaner cuts of meat, so like the loin, um, nuts, seeds, if you're vegetarian, tofu, tempeh, seitan, hummus, beans, legumes, all really good sources of protein.
And, I think if we're really concentrating on protein,
Yeah.
I think myself and a lot of my patients have found it a really positive impact on how we're creating our diet, because to get enough protein, you really have to be eating, and you
Yeah.
have to be thinking about adding to your diet instead of restricting your diet, which is, maybe how many of us have thought about our diet up until now, right? So
Right,
be
right. And I
liberating.
think when people come to me, they say that they're like, "Oh, you're going to tell me what not to eat," and it's actually what we want to add back into your diet that's important.
There's also a question about whey supplements, and maybe even more specifically, does grass-fed whey make a difference?
So whey protein is a milk. I was just looking at the chat questions. There's so many good questions. Whey protein is they tend to be lactose or milk based. They contain dairy. Um, and the type of protein, when you're looking at different protein shakes, that you probably want to aim for is something called whey protein isolate. If you are someone who consumes dairy, looking for that in the ingredient is really important. There are brands of protein shakes I really like. I'm happy to give you some names. So there's a protein shake called Iconic Protein, has some fiber, pretty low in sugar. You can find it on Amazon. I don't think they sell it at Whole Foods anymore. And then kind of just your standard that for plant-based, like the Orgain lower sugar protein shakes are great. I try to look for protein shakes that have at least 20 to 30 grams of fiber per, a protein per scoop. So 20 to 30 grams of protein per serving. And then ones that don't have a lot of sugar, and have ideally, like if you can try to get it, a couple grams of fiber are great.
Excellent. Great advice. There's another question here about omega-3 to omega-6 ratios. And I
Mhm.
think maybe that other question about talking about grass-fed versus not grass-fed was trying to get at some of these
Oh,
omega-3s
yes, the
too.
grass-fed question. Yes. So I think grass-fed, ideally, when you can do grass-fed, that's that's wonderful because yes, so something that we talk about sometimes are the different types of omega-3s. We know that omega-3s, so omega-3 sources are the most favorable on heart health. And then there are things like sixes and nine, omega-6s, omega-9s. When you're consuming more grass-fed, meats, when you're consuming more wild salmon, you're getting more of those omega-3 sources. And so I think anytime you can do that, you're in a good spot. Omega-6s and 9s, the only time I don't like people to get caught up on those is sometimes people will look at different types of nuts and worry that one type of nut has more omega-6s or omega-9s than a different type of nut. To me, and just for simplicity's sake, all nuts for the most part are pretty good for your heart. And so I wouldn't want people to worry too much about that.
Yeah, so I think that helps to simplify that, because I do
Yeah,
think many of us sometimes feel overwhelmed by the amount of decisions, right, that we're
totally.
forced to make to choose healthy items. So that is nice guidance. And then again, I know you spent a couple of slides talking about omega-3s, but do you want to just summarize like kind of easy ways to get those in your diet?
Yes. So flax seeds. Sorry, gave me a thumbs up. Flax seeds, walnuts, salmon, tuna. So any fatty fish. Brussels sprouts actually convert to omega-3s when you cook them, which is interesting. Hummus with tahini. So tahini, you can get some omega-3s from. Any fatty fish. I think those are the big sources.
That's great. And then there's a good source of ALA, which also gets converted,
Yes.
right, to some of the EPA in like
Yes.
chia seeds and flax seeds. So you had mentioned
Yes.
those.
Yes. Chia seeds, flax seeds. The Brussels sprouts would be one of those ALA foods that they convert. Yeah, they can convert to omega-3s, and those are great. There was a second part. Was there a second part to that question, Allison?
I don't think so. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. Oh, I wasn't sure if it was so summarizing it, and then the supplement piece, which I mentioned, which we've kind of talked about a bit before, but if an omega-3 supplement is recommended, to try to make sure that you're looking at that true amount of EPA, DHA, because that gives you the most accurate picture of how much omega-3s are in there. And I've at least seen, and I don't know what you prescribe in terms of a therapeutic dose of omega-3, but it seems like somewhere between 2 to 4 grams or 2,000 to 4,000 of EPA, DHA sometimes makes a difference in people's triglyceride levels, but it's all individual.
Yeah, and that's where I like really following people's labs after an
Yeah,
intervention to see if
totally. Yes,
they
exactly.
make a difference.
Yes.
We're getting close to the end here, so there are a couple questions about intermittent fasting. So let's talk about that in our last few minutes.
Yeah, so I've been working a lot more with perimenopause, menopause, postmenopausal women a bit more in practice, and there's so much research going on in that area. Intermittent fasting seems to have some favorable results for that group. It also seems to have some favorable results on people's sleep, and some of my patients swear by it for weight management. I myself am not a huge proponent of intermittent fasting, because I sometimes find that it slows metabolism down a bit if it's not done, precisely, which is hard. Whether it's the 16 to 8 fast or, and depending on how many days of the week you do it. If you wanted to work an intermittent fasting type model into your lifestyle, I think one of the great things about intermittent fasting for many people is it stops their eating at like 6 o'clock. And so for many patients, that tends to be the time where stuff happens, is after dinner, when they're
You
watching
mean like
TV.
snacking and desserts and
For
things
me
like
too,
that.
yeah. That's like what chocolates and, all the stuff is kind of out. And so I think intermittent fasting really helps to kind of cut that time. Um, if a patient comes to me that wants to intermittently fast, I just make sure that we do it the right way. But in some people, I have seen it kind of slow things down a bit in terms of metabolism.
Yeah, and so intermittent fasting obviously is shrinking that window that we eat. So it's also been called time restricted eating, right? Where you have a window.
Yes.
And, my approach with my patients is if it's easy and it works, then it's great and we can follow you. If you find it very challenging and
Yes.
it's hard, like maybe that, isn't going to work for you and we should try to figure out another way, to be thinking about your optimal health.
I think that's 100% spot on. And I think that's with anything. So if there's a plan that works best for someone, there's ways to make it more heart healthy. There's ways to kind of work around it and make it work, for someone's lifestyle. So, but it has to be approachable and it has to be easy because you won't stick to it if it's not.
And the other piece of that too is as we're really encouraging people to get all these micronutrients, potassium, right, and even macronutrients, enough protein in your diet, if you shrink that window too much, especially if you're really committed to exercise, you're
Yes.
just not going to be able, right, to build in enough quality meals in that short period. So
Right.
just another thing to think about.
Yes. And some people need a little bit in the morning before they exercise. They need to have something. So I think that's spot on.
So with that, it has been a full hour and I hope everybody enjoyed this discussion. I think we got through, 95% of the questions. If we
Good.
didn't answer your question, Skylar will go through what's left over and I think
Yes.
she has a meal plan for us.
Yep.
And then also her contact information to book appointments if that is of interest to any of our patients. So this has been wonderful, Skylar. Thank you for your time today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And Dr. Lee Lewis and I am working on programming. We might have a couple months without programming, but then hopefully we'll be coming back with some fun lecture series for the fall.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you all so much for your time.
Be well.
Bye.